There's a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt that I think is useful for us to begin, especially locally. She said, she served as the chair of the drafting committee for the Universal Declaration. She said, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small spaces, close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world." I think we all, those of us who are here today, are here because we have a strong commitment to the idea of civil rights and human rights. And this has been a very difficult year for those of us who feel these things. And each day we wake up and we find more and more difficult things that we have to deal with. And here with the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, we are here to deal with human rights and civil rights in those small places, in our home, those spaces that Eleanor Roosevelt was talking about. And since many of you, I think, are not familiar with the work of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, I'm just going to read you a little blurb about our history and our mission. The roots of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission go back to 1964, when the modern-day civil rights movement manifested in San Francisco through demonstrations against hotels, supermarkets, drive-in restaurants, and automobile showrooms that discriminated against African Americans. In early 1964, Mayor John Shelley appointed an interim committee on human relations, which subsequently recommended to the Board of Supervisors that a permanent Human Rights Commission be established. In July 1964, the Board of Supervisors passed the recommendation, and Mayor Shelley signed an ordinance establishing the Human Rights Commission. From 1964, the Human Rights Commission grew in response to city government's mandate to address the causes and problems resulting from prejudice, intolerance, bigotry, and discrimination. The mayor and the Board of Supervisors gave the Human Rights Commission more and broader powers and duties to address these problems and passed additional ordinances which were implemented by the Human Rights Commission. In June of 1990, the voters of San Francisco established the Human Rights Commission as a charter commission. So for over 50 years, the San Francisco Human Rights Commission has grown in response to San Francisco's mandate to address the causes and problems resulting from prejudice, intolerance, bigotry, and discrimination. So that's what we do here locally in San Francisco, close to home. And so we're so happy today to be able to make the connection with the UN Association and look forward to working together in the coming year and beyond that. And I especially have the pleasure of welcoming you to a conversation with our executive director, Cheryl Evans Davis, and Danny Glover, who is a native San Franciscan and an amazing human being. Pretty good actor too. I think we've seen a few of his movies. But Mr. Glover, his history is, I'm not even going to try to encompass it. The one thing I do want to emphasize, though, he is a native San Franciscan, a graduate of SF State, and I'm not sure if he began his activism there, but he certainly began it's a most visible chapter of his activism when, as a student, along with a number of other members of the Black Student Union, they engaged in the longest, I think it's still the longest strike in U.S. history of a student organization, to protest the treatment and the lack of educational opportunity for students of color, specifically Black students at that time. And they established the first ethnic studies program and the first Black studies program. And from there, his activism grew, and it still exists today. So thank you so much. I'm not going to take any more of your time. I'm going to give you to Director Davis and Mr. Glover.
My niece, Danielle Glover, told me to focus, so I'm getting focused. Okay?
Getting focused. I had a set of things that I wanted to talk to Danny Glover about, but before we got up here, we were having this conversation. Someone had told me that he was an expert in the social justice pieces or ideas and knowledge around Albert Einstein, and so he was sharing a little bit of that. So I was just going to ask him if he didn't mind sharing a little bit of that, if it's still fresh in your mind from.
I'm kind of one of the, Albert Einstein has always fascinated me. Most of the popular information about Albert Einstein does not reveal the incredible role that he played in relationship to human rights and social justice. Albert Einstein was on the defense committee of the Scottsboro Boys, a famous case in the 30s in the South where several men were accused of raping a white woman. He was on their defense committee. Albert Einstein, along with Paul Robeson, another name that we feel seem to be disappeared from our memory, were the co-chairs of the anti-lynching campaign in 1946. That's the year I was born, 1946. And so it's fascinating that Ida B. Wells, a great journalist and feminist of the last part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, led an anti-lynching campaign 50 years before that of Albert Einstein and Paul Robeson. And it's a very interesting story because there was a meeting with Truman, and I remember some time ago, there was this whole uproar about when Trent Locke, remember Trent Locke, senator from Mississippi, said that things would have been different if Strom Thurmond had been president, and there was a major uproar about that. It was Strom Thurmond who jumped the Democratic Party, and we'll remember the Dixiecrats. And there was a great major discussion about that time, the re-election of Harry Truman, who took over for Roosevelt, who had died in office, while in office. And there's a major discussion at that time about several things. One of them was the whole issue of states' rights. And out of that discussion, part of that discussion was also a subsection of it was this whole anti-lynching campaign, a national campaign to make anti-lynching a federal offense. And there was a lot of uproar about that, discussion about that and everything. So there was a meeting with Truman. Paul Robeson was at that meeting. W.B. Du Bois was at that meeting. The great, my sense of great intellectual of the 20th century, W.B. Du Bois, was at that meeting, and several others. Albert Einstein was supposed to be at that meeting, but was ill and could not make that meeting. And at that meeting, as Truman, the president then, began to procrastinate about supporting this legislation, this whole campaign, was getting a lot of pressure from the Dixiecrats, and of course, you see how powerful they are now. Imagine how powerful they were 70 years ago, and getting a lot of pressure from them. And so, Robeson, you know how, I mean, Mary McLeod Bethune called him the tallest tree in our forest, and he was that too. And Truman was pretty diminutive. So he said to Truman, the president, if you can't find a way to protect us, we'll find a way to protect ourselves. Truman immediately dismissed the meeting at that time. And from that moment on, Robeson was chased, and we know what happened in history about Paul Robeson. Most of us knew what happened to him. Basically written out of our history at that, our own memory at that time. So it's interesting that Albert Einstein, and I was wanted to do a movie about that. A movie about Robeson, the relationship between them. Because if one had something in common, the one thing that they loved music. Paul Robeson not only was a great articulate fighter I spoke fluently 12 languages at least for human rights, but also was in one of the great voices of the 20th century as well. And so they both had, so we were trying to do a film about the relationship between them. because just before he went to his hearing on the House on Un-American Activities, Robeson went to visit Albert Einstein. These are little tidbits of history that you don't know, and had it not been for the major campaign in 1933, just as Hitler was taking over, to get Albert Einstein here. He had been teaching it every year. He'd come and teach at CalArts. It was a major campaign. He may have been a victim of the Third Reich as well.
You talk about Einstein and Robeson and their voices, and I just recently went to see an exhibit of Gordon Parks, and one of the quotes from Gordon Parks was that he used his photography and filmmaking as a weapon, right, to fight injustice. And so I've been thinking a lot about, like, how do you use and think about the arts as a weapon for fighting injustice, or the role that you have, like using your platform as a way and a means to fight social injustice and to fight for human rights.
There's sometimes we think of this system of art, cultural production, which is imposed on us as well. But we have to remember, there were people like Clifford Odette, Awake and Sing, Waiting for Lefty. I mean, these were radicals. These were people who were radical and used art as a platform. There's this great story about Orson Welles, does this all-black production of Macbeth in 1936. So there's a history of where art has always been a force used as a platform in which people could certainly provide information. I was just thinking about, as I'm talking, so everything which sometimes randomly comes off my mind, I'm just thinking about 1199, one of the largest locals in the country, if not one of the largest locals in the world, with over 600,000 members, had a cultural wing. It's a union, service workers, and a cultural wing called Bread and Roses. Years ago, I staged read a play written by Ossie Davis, written for Bread and Roses, and it was about a case in South Carolina in 1948, a case around desegregation in 1948, 6 years before Brown versus Board of Education. So the idea that there have been efforts ever since Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, in order to overturn separate but equal. It didn't just happen in 1954. So art has been the major reference. And when you had unions and you had the public space was democratized in such a way over a period of time. It wasn't expensive, pretty expensive to make films. You can make films. You can, Citizen Kane, there you go right there. What a great film. What an anti-establishment film, Citizen Kane. So these are the kind of stories that in some sense shape our own kind of images of ourselves. These kind of moments right here in art, through art. And because unions had their own publications, other organs in public society in the public space had their own publication. You weren't just dominated by the big three, ABC, NBC, and CBS at one time. There were other people who had their vision and were able to promote their vision and articulate their vision to a particular audience, And that's basically the role that art often played. And it still plays that role to some extent. For instance, we produced, my company, Louverture Films. It's named after after Toussaint Louverture, with my extraordinary producing partner, Jocelyn Barnes. We produced 2 films this year, one called The White Sun, which is a film from Nepal, from a wonderful young director, Deepak Ramnath. And it takes place right after the conflict between the internal conflict and civil war that taking place in Nepal. Now, just last week, Nepal had its election again. You know, so the film itself was a segue to have the extraordinary conversation about what was happening, what had happened, not only in the past, but how the country was moving forward in the future at the time. The film represented that. It's Nepal's entry into the for best foreign language film for the Oscars. Also, we produced a film called Zama. Zama is an important novel out in Latin America, written in the 1940s, I think 1940, 1950, and it's about the colonial period in Argentina, the end of the 18th century. An extraordinary film by an extraordinary filmmaker, and a visionary filmmaker, Lucrecia Martel. And it is also Argentina's entry into the discussion for best foreign language films. Some have rated it as one of the best films totally this year, period this year. It sparked a discussion in Argentina about the colonial period and everything. That's what material was able to do, art is able to do. And fortunately, what we've been able to do at Louverture Films is create films like, produce films like The Trouble the Water, which was a film about Katrina from the inside out. We're able to produce a film about the House I Live In by Eugene Jarecki, about the war on drugs. Another discussion about the war on drugs that not simply that brought all the stakeholders, those who were the victim, those who were victimized by it, those who were the perpetrators, brought them together at the table and have this discussion. That's what film should do. That's what art should do. It should bring us to some place where we should be able to discuss, have some sort of understanding, not only simply about what had happened, you know, what is happening, and what are the prospects of the future.
Well, I'm looking in the front and I see two of our commissioners from the Board of Education, Commissioner Emily Marasse and President of the Board of Education, Shaman Walton. And as you talk about the arts, like, what about that as a human right in terms of in education, in opportunity, and the impact that you think that would play?
Well, we were just having a discussion about the Ethnic Studies program at San Francisco State, which I, with many others, nameless people, and some people who I'll never forget, who were part of that period of devising the idea of an Ethnic Studies program. And it's a very interesting way, well, most people say, well, all these people came together at a particular point in time, and they decided they wanted to form an Ethnic Studies program. It wasn't that romantic as it is. It was. Being it from the inside, you know, the ideas around that emerged from communities. Whether it was a powerful, strong Hispanic community, not simply in the mission, but certainly connected to the work of Cesar Chavez and the organization of farm workers and other rights, fighting the right, strong issues within the Asian American community, around community and everything else, strong issues in the African American community. So what was certainly not absent from the whole process was the input and the strong movements that were happening within communities themselves in 1967, 1968. And as it turned out, we felt, along with an alliance with teachers and professors, you know, who had their own grievances as well, we were able to be effective in not only addressing our own particular issues, but also addressing those issues of professors as well. But this is a radical precept. This is not something that says that you just come up with. The idea is a radical concept, the idea to talk about these issues. What has happened is certainly to some degree in all our discussion. If we look at our history, we look at the great movements that happened in the 20th century, whether it was Eugene Debs from Terre Haute, Idaho, who's in jail for sedition, running for president as a socialist and getting votes in there, or whether it was, you know, whether it was Du Bois, the great thinker who wrote an extraordinary book. If you want to look at Black Reconstruction, Du Bois' work that he worked on from 1936 to 1941. Read Black Reconstruction and look at black labor, particularly, and he defines this whole idea of the veil and understanding who we are right here. Du Bois and all these great thinkers who were at this particular point in time. I mentioned Ida B. Wells, but many others that we could talk about. I love the story about Harry Bridges. Harry Bridges in 1935 went around, and there wasn't a Bay Bridge around here, went around to all the black churches here in San Francisco and said, if you don't cross the picket line on our strike, if you don't become scabs on our strike, I promise you that there'll be black men who are working at the docks when we win the strike. The operative word, when we win. And that's what he did. I don't know, in this family, there's someone here connected with their father, their grandfather, or their uncle, or their great uncle got hired when they won the strike in 1935. It is also, the strike was instrumental in bringing about what had happened in terms of the New Deal. The New Deal wasn't some benevolent kind of suggestion, idea of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. New Deal was pushed and forced upon it. It's always been those moments where we pushed and forced and pushed the envelope for changes to happen. I don't care if it's for ethnic groups, I don't care if it's for women, it's always been that. I don't care if it's LGBTQ, it's always been were the radical moments where we pushed the deal and pushed the envelope for things to change. It's only happened. Art has a role to play in that, in a sense. It has to have, it's integral to that process and everything. You know, when I think about Du Bois is one of the interesting people for me, because he was born 3 years after the Civil War. 3 years after the Civil War in 1868, and he died on the day, on the eve of the March on Washington in 1963. So he covered that whole period, you know, writing some of the most extraordinary work. Arguably the father of modern sociology with the Philadelphia Study in 1899, and certainly Souls of Black Folk. They lead Souls of Black Folks everywhere in the world, translated everywhere in the world. So this is one of the most interesting moments that we're able to capture. But also, Du Bois was also part of the Harlem Renaissance in the 20s. He not only Harlem Renaissance, he published the Crisis magazine, and one of the founders of the NAACP at the Niagara Conference in 1909, along with Ida B. Wells and others. But he also was able to publish the Crisis magazine, and the Crisis magazine published in 1917 published the signature form by Langston Hughes, "The Negro Speaks of Rivers." I've known rivers older than the flow of blood, older than the human brain. That's the connecting art, politics also. He solicited, and then Robeson, of course. They were co-founders of the Committee for African Liberation in 1939. Visionaries, knowing that there was going to be a struggle for independence and sovereignty, decolonization after the war. You know, they were founders of this organization. They had to begin the discussion. That's the kind of nature. That's the nature of movement. It's not for, and they happen here. We've seen them. We've seen the Occupy movement. We've seen Black Lives Matter. We see those movements right here that happen in the same thing, that address the issue and change the narrative. The process is, how do we change the narrative?
So you've said so much, my mind is spinning, right? So first off, Harlem Renaissance, and then you just quoted The Negro Speaks of Rivers and Langston Hughes, and like one of my favorite go-to poems is A Dream Deferred, right? As we talk about what happens to a dream deferred.
Does it drive like a raisin in the sun?
Which most people don't know is where A Raisin in the Sun for Lorraine Hansberry.
Raisin in the Sun. The great play, The River Niger,
right,
comes out of that, Raising the Sun. And then look here.
But it speaks to me.
It's Lorraine Hansberry. Right. Boy, if you look at Lorraine Hansberry, it's incredible feminist. It's Lorraine Hansberry writing Well, I've had a chance to, you know, if you deconstruct, just analyze Raising in the Sun. If you read the play, it is so full of now, the past, the present, the future. It's amazing how she was able to weave all these particular stories in this. It's amazing. But other films, Les Blanc, other plays that she did, Les Blanc, in this sense, looking at Les Blanc from the standpoint of African liberation and the relationship between the mother country and the colony and everything else. Les Blanc is one. Well, she was beginning writing a play on Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution. You know, there's footage of this reading with Lloyd Richards on PBS and everything. So these were artists, and imagine, I would have loved to be on a fly on the wall to listen to the discussions and arguments that Lorraine Hansberry and Baldwin had, James Baldwin had. You can imagine these amazing, incredible minds, you know, and human beings. And it was, I don't think that someone needs to do a play about that. Lorraine, fictionalizing a relationship between, and the conversations that Lorraine Hansberry and James Baldwin had, you know. Two of the most incredible, articulate minds in any point in time. This is where art is there. But what are the movements around here? When did they write these things? When did Lorraine Hansberry write A Raisin in the Sun? 1958? 27 years old, 28 years old when she wrote that play, you know, taking this. So she was able to have this vision of the future, the present, the past, the present, and the future. And Baldwin, he wrote, if you ever get a chance, I don't know, I'm talking about, read James Baldwin's essays. I mean, I think the first thing I read when I was like 17 years old, the first book I read, The Fire Next Time. James knows about that. Everybody who's around our age read The Fire Next Time. We were in 16, 17, 8 years old. And it was transformative in a sense. So all these, so you have these artists right here who are devoted to a vision. This is not airport reading. It's not airport novels.
Right.
These guys are writing about real stuff,
right.
you know. I love reading Baldwin. I always pick up something to read an essay of Baldwin. You know.
I think the challenge is, I've been talking to young folks about how, and I don't know how familiar you are with this, like the Kendrick Lamars and the Chance the Rappers and folks that are coming up now, but that are in some ways speaking truth in their, you know, I may not always agree with some of the language that they use, but the message that they share with young people. And I think during the era of Baldwin and Du Bois and of Langston Hughes, people weren't always happy with the message or the way that they shared out some of what they were saying.
I mean, it was these communities of activism, and I think today, you know, I was involved, James and I, someone who's been very important in our lives, Harry Belafonte, has been of everything from his gathering. Right after Katrina, was a gathering, he began to gather. I think we talked to members of the First Nation people, we met with members of the Hispanic, Asian American community, and all these kids, young people, bringing together, having to say, where do we come? And Harry likes to say that one of the young men said, well, asked him, well, what's the agenda? And they said, and Harry said something like, the agenda is to find the agenda. The agenda is to find the agenda. And I think we find those moments. I mean, and I think we're finding them more. And I don't spend time reading, trying to figure out what this next thing that the president says. You know, whatever he tweets or whatever. What are we doing? How are we in a sense internalizing this moment? You know, Draymond Green said something. And sometimes we take Draymond Green off the cuff somewhere. He said about Mark Cuban. Mark Cuban doesn't know how I feel when I see Charlottesville. Mark Cuban doesn't know how I feel when another black boy is how I feel, because here with Draymond, wherever you're from, Michigan or wherever you're from, he's connected to not simply that moment, that pain right there. He's connected to the historic pain. The historic pain and what it is. And that's what, when I think about Walter Lee, you take the character, Walter Lee in Raging in the Sun, the main character, the male protagonist. He's dealing with the historic pain. He's dealing with not only his pain, he's dealing with his father's pain, his grandfather's pain, and the pain before, all that historic pain, in that sense. And I think on the one hand, when I think about young people and understanding that, and understanding what you see is not something, some sort of something that necessitates itself at this moment, but it's part of the historic thing. And I went down to see, and I'm sorry I'm going to jump in. I went down to see I got on the road on the 9th of November last year. I got on the road. I had to go somewhere. We were planning a march in Mississippi workers in Canton, Mississippi, with the AUAW. So I went to meet Dennis Williams on the 10th. I was met him on the morning of the 10th to plan this march for workers in Canton, Mississippi. And that slogan was, "Workers' rights are human rights." That was there. They have been everything and justly treated at this plant, Nissan plant in Mississippi. So I went on the road, and then I'm on the board of the Center for Economic Policy and Research with Mark Weisbrot and Gene Baker, who were the founders of that, and also the Center for Policies, the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. So I just went down and we just talked and everything. But my main trip was to go down, moving my way south to see my 95-year-old, 94-year-old at the time, cousin, who was my mother's one of two first cousins she has. One, Fannie Bell and Rosalie. Fannie's she'll be 95 January 19. Rosalie made 100 September 1st this year. And so I went down to see Fannie. I couldn't find her. It was Sunday. I was looking all over for her. Where's Fannie? And she wasn't at her house. And mind you, I was born right at this old Stanford Hospital, but I've been going to Louisville, Georgia since I was 6 months old. You know, in fact, a lot of me is so integrated in that because I lived with my grandparents on 2 occasions, farmers, poor farmers, started out as tenant farmers and itinerary farmers, own their own farm and everything. And so I've been going down there since 1946. I've been going at 47, I've been going. I lived 2 years with them, almost 2 years with them, on 2 different occasions. So I went to see Fannie. And I said, where were you, Fannie? I finally called her at about 9:30. I said, where you at, Fannie? Where you been? I said, we went to church at Jones Grove, praying. Sunday after the election, praying. God, praying about what had happened. We were sitting there discussing and praying. We know that's not Fannie. Those Fannies were 100 years before that. And 100 years before that, praying about what had happened. Jesus, what faith. And I said, what you think? She says, this country has lost its way with God. Huh? This country has lost its way with God. And as Harry tells the story about Martin Luther King, when Martin Luther King said, Harry, I don't know if I'm integrating my people into a burning house. And Harry says, after all the work we've been doing over the last year, what do you suggest we do? He says, I guess we have to become firemen. I guess we have to become firemen. You know, praying. So when she was saying it's lost its way with God, we got to help it find its way back with God. That's what he's saying. That's the human right. And certainly, you know, I've been in the Goodwills. I've been a Goodwill ambassador for like 20 years now. First with the UN Development Program, UNDP, and now since 2004, just before the landmine conference in Nairobi, I became a Goodwill ambassador with UNICEF. I still travel on behalf of UNICEF regularly. Wherever I am, I'm doing something on behalf of UNICEF. I believe in the idea of the UN. The UN is one of the great concepts, and I remember when I was a kid and I first saw the UN building, and I wanted to do something with that because of the idea of bringing people together. When I was like 14 years old, 15 years old when I saw it. So the idea of that, and it was the question always, and I thought about this moment as we celebrate the 70th year, you know, of the Human Rights Commission, and how we often talk about human rights in a sense. We don't talk about it within the own context that we live in. Don't you think that having all the homeless people we see out on the streets in San Francisco and Oakland and everything is a human rights violation? Do we see that? Where do we draw on what political action, political projects, or what action we take as human beings in addressing that issue? Don't you see the lack of affordable housing in this city right here? You know, when I worked at Model Cities, I mean, we were talking about it, and we were talking about affordable housing, the program, we're talking about affordable. There's not even a discussion about affordable housing. Not even a dialogue. There's no whimper. This whole concept of the market this and the market that is crap. You know what I'm saying? It's terrible. What does that have to be about human beings and their existence? You know, the ideas around the whole idea around the Enlightenment period, the period of the right to exist. I mean, most of the people lived in rural areas at the point in time. Like, you know, the Magna Carta itself, the Magna Carta about due process, about the outlawing of torture, the Magna Carta. That's what the Magna Carta was about. What about this whole process? You see all this happening right here. What does the right to exist mean right now in the 21st century? Jobs, you know, and I think about all this, the whole idea of gentrification. Isn't that a violation? Where do we see that? Isn't that some sort of violation of people's right to exist? You know, if we're talking about human rights, then we have to look at it in all its manifestations, not presenting the most egregious and the most glaring examples of human rights, abuse in there, and they are. They're arguing. We're talking about right here the issue of trafficking. Of course, that is real in a sense. That is real. But where does it take place where it's right within our framework, right there in the political culture which accepts it, embraces the idea of this idea of the absence of human rights. These people are there and talk about the market here and pass legislation for this and that. All of this is, there has to be all of on our table in a sense. It has to be a part of that. So when I talk about the workers in Canton, Mississippi, talking about as they went around and said, we have a right to have a union or the vote, have a voice and determine that without being intimidated, without being abused on the job, and without all the things. We have the right to do that. And I've been working with them for 6 years. I've been working for 6 years, and you can see the emergence of this, their own sense of their own self and their own leadership within it. Yeah, we lost this first round in this election right here, but we only have to win one election. We just have to win one election. Yeah, and perhaps we'll gather the strength to do that. But the idea around this celebration of this, it means everywhere there's 7 billion people on the planet. Something is happening, more than 7 billion people. Something is happening that the poor become poor and those with incredible wealth become more wealthy. And control the public space, the common space, own often the common space itself, and everything else. So we have to be talking from that point. And it has to be, what has to change are the kind of radical notions that Emma Goldman thought about almost 100 years ago, and others who thought about the many that I remember, that Ida B. Wells thought about. We have to be in that sense, and stood up in the face of some of the most abusive and dangerous, putting their lives on the line often to do this. We have to be talking about that in the sense, in that discussion. And where young people are talking about that, where I see them talking about that, where I see, old timers, OGs like myself talking about that, OG talking about that. That's where that's the part of the discussion we had to be in. This city, I love this city. I've lived in the Haight-Ashbury since I was 11 years old. My parents moved from first we lived in the projects in Hunters Point, then we lived in the projects on Army Street. There were projects on Army and 3rd. Then we moved up to the 19th Street project just below Betrayal Hill, We moved there before my parents scraped together enough money, and it was cheap. It was relatively cheap to scrape over to buy a little house that we all crowded in, but there was home in 1957, and lived there, and know that, right on Central Street. And
Well, I will say, so I think that, I wanted to ask more and we're at time, but I just wanted to acknowledge that I think that what you've said in this last go round is what resonates the most, which is what I hope everyone hears, is that there's no competition between local and national and international, that violation of the human rights at any level is a violation.
Absolutely. And we, absolutely. And that's about the radical nature of our history, but it often included internationalism. We always connected the international to the national, and we had examples. I mean, Kwame Nkrumah went to Lincoln University. That's where he graduated from. Kwame Nkrumah, first president graduate. Who was at Lincoln University? Langston Hughes, Thurgood Marshall. They were connected. They all went to Lincoln University. So there's always a kind of, I remember talking to Walter Sisulu, I think the soul and consciousness of the ANC. Walter Sisulu, meeting with him in Soweto, and we had a conversation. He talked about all the delegations in the 30s and the 40s that would come to South Africa and talk about, and not only talk about their issues, but understand what clearly in tune with the issues of South Africa and Africa itself. The Council on African Affairs, I said that Robeson, what imagination Robeson and Du Bois formed, or the idea about an anti-lynching campaign. What imagination? That's about imagination. With Einstein and Robeson, all these kind of things about using and connecting to our imagination and celebrating our imagination as well. And where we get into it, because I don't know where being accommodationist gets us. I don't know,
Well, we thank you for being with us today and for sharing so much with us. We appreciate it. I just think there's just not enough time in the day to get all that's swirling around in your head and the experiences, the knowledge, but just thank you so much for making time to be with us. Thank you.
I just want to say this is the decade of African descendants. Not a lot of people know it. My sister and I were at the Institute for the Black World last weekend. I can't remember where it was. I think it was last weekend. And we were talking about the issues around reparation, and amazing what they're doing in CARICOM. CARICOM is the Organization of Caribbean States, and the work they're doing around around reparations, to study Sir Hilary Beckles, extraordinary mind, is the dean of the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. Has done extraordinary work, you know, along with, and they've got heads of states within the Caribbean community to directly address the issue of reparations to the former colonies, France and the UK, you know. And it's amazing, but just the issue, this idea of the African descendant. I'm the special assigned rapporteur. A person to that is Mario Fanon, who is the daughter of Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon, a great thinker and psychiatrist, who wrote extraordinary books, Wretched Earth, Black Skin, White Mass, you know, and we're there, so I've been doing that for 3 years. I went to Friday night in the little community, Louisville, Georgia, where my mother is from. It's really an amazing, it was the first capital of the state of Georgia before the Revolutionary War. But it's memorable for, as the capital seat, is memorable for the passage of a land sale where in 1794, just 6 years after ratification, 5 years after ratification of the Constitution, the legislative body sold 350 million acres of land to New York speculators, 1794, for a penny and a half per acre. Penny and a half per acre. The incoming legislative body in 1796 overturned that. Supreme Court made a decision in 1802 validating the original sale. 350 million acres for a penny and a half. It's called the Yazoo fraud. It is now, all that land and territory is part of Mississippi and Alabama. If you look at the Yazoo fraud, it fueled with something that remarkable happened, and a gift that the United States received in 1804. That's when Napoleon sold the whole Louisiana purchase for $13 million. So desperate for money because Haitian slaves had defeated them and formed their own nation in 1804. Led first by Toussaint Louverture, then Henri Christophe, and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. 1804, so the U.S. had this whole, so really, this whole spatch of land. But really, so then you have General Jackson, Andrew Jackson, the Indian warrior, everything else. So what happened, it has fueled the expansion of slavery. Expansion of slavery such rapidly from 1800 to by about 1844, the U.S. became the most powerful country economically in the world because of cotton, the first engine of the Industrial Revolution. The cotton and this machine, which British industrialists invented, which were able to take cotton and make it into thread faster than ever imaginable by human hand. So cotton had been, before that invention of 1800, had been a luxury item, now it was a cheap item. It fueled the expansion of slavery, and certainly it built the economy that this country has, its first economy. Thank you.
We have to have him do a master class, right, on human rights.